The cornfields were dying, and had been for months. Stalks brown and brittle swam by Anthony Rice like a funeral procession. Someone had told him this process was necessary for the production of sweet corn. He found the whole thing rather unsavoury, and wondered if the sea of waning plants felt some fragmented form of pain underneath the weight of the scorching sun. He moved to Toledo, Ohio, after a teaching position was offered to him out of the blue. Desperate for steady work, he moved away from New York City and settled down in Lucas County, telling himself the move was only temporary. A mere stepping stone became his mantra, and the lie he told his peers and colleagues. But 7 years later he became accustomed to the glass city, despite his misgivings, and even managed to settle down with a kind woman named Lowen. She loved the Midwest, and Anthony wasn't sure if he had it in him to uproot her for his own selfish desires. Driving down 33 miles of long winding roads with nothing but health podcasts and a cartoonish mole man bobblehead to keep him company, Anthony wished he had a different view outside his smudged windows, preferably palm trees or maybe even some desert terrain. The team of construction workers building an imaginary 2-story house on top of ancient ocean floors was ideal. He dreamed of convincing Lauren to move with him to Miami, or maybe somewhere exotic like Thailand. Heard the American dollar goes a long way out there. He dug around the glove compartment, stretching his right arm in the darkness until his fingers clasped around a brown bottle. Snapping the lid off with a pop, he tossed back 3 purple pills, meant to get rid of his anxiety and release a rush of dopamine. After he arrived in the cramped office with low-hanging ceilings and sterile walls, he poured himself a strong cup of dark coffee with tons of sugar, wiped the sleep from the corners of his eyes, sat down at his mahogany desk and turned on his desktop computer. When the hell are these pills going to kick in? It was simple enough work, crunching numbers, updating records, comparing data sets, and checking boxes. He checked some emails and opened a new one from one of their biggest clients, a pharmaceutical company overseas. There was an attachment which he assumed came from their data warehouse in need of data organization. It seemed to take an eternity to download, freezing every other application on his computer. When it was done, he attempted opening the file called Ostara Exec and received a notification saying it was corrupted. His screen went haywire, and green blocks smeared across his monitor in sickening patches. Stop! 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 For the love of God, don't be a virus! Anthony clicked the mouse continuously, but there was nothing he could do to stop the digital infection. The damage was done and he'd have to call technical support for assistance. He unplugged the computer, hoping that would do something positive. Stepping on his own foot and relishing the flare of pain, he glanced up at the digital clock on the wall. It read 8:05 a.m. That's impossible, he thought. How can it be this early? I swore it was just 9 a.m. The birds bordering the clock face seemed to laugh at him, twittering about the edges of the frame. Anthony took a deep breath and closed his eyes tight, digging his fingers into the meat of his thighs, despite the slim barrier of duck canvas fabric between his nails and flesh. 1, 2, 3. He opened his eyes and looked up with a ball of hope lodged inside his chest. Time remained the same. Numbers frozen. Suspicious and paranoid, he surveyed the room, expecting to find a giggling co-worker hiding behind a cubicle wall. All he found were empty chairs and silence. It seemed like everyone left the office, just up and disappeared, leaving Anthony out of the loop. And these damn pills weren't doing their job. He picked up the wireless office phone and dialed technical support. The phone screeched like a banshee, and he dropped it. Anthony paced the room, circling around deserted cubicles in ever-widening circles and dizzying lines, the screech still ringing inside his ears. He sat with a sigh and gripped the armrests of his ergonomic chair until his knuckles turned white, whiter than the sterile walls that enclosed him. "Think, Anthony, think," he commanded himself. But nothing sprang out of the empty wasteland he called his brain. "My cell phone!" he thought, and slammed his fist on the desk. He flipped it open, but the screen remained black, reflecting the worry lines etched across his sweaty forehead, and a brown age spot etched on his cheek like a tattoo. He pressed the buttons frantically, battering them with clammy thumbs, waiting for the screen to light up. Nothing happened. He threw the cell phone clear across the room and relished the sound of the device smashing into pieces. It broke the silence and managed to calm his nerves for a moment. "Maybe I need some more coffee," he thought, savoring the imaginary flavor. Anthony tried to stand, but he was glued to his seat, unable to move. "What the fuck?" he muttered, struggling to get out of his chair. Sweat ran down his ruddy face, coming to rest on the tip of his broad nose. His button-up shirt seemed too tight, closing in around his neck. He tugged at the collar, desperately searching for air. What would Lauren think of this? He suddenly thought. She knew how to calm him down, knew how to say the right order of words to reassure him during the times of anxiety, wanted to take him under. His wife's soft voice filled his ears. "You're a damn fool, Anthony. That's what you are. Look at you, getting all worked up over nothing. Get out of your head." Her hearty laughter filled the room for what felt like forever, but eventually faded into the cold, foreboding silence. "This is all wrong. Nothing makes any sense. Am I having a mental breakdown? Am I going through a bout of psychosis?" He sniffled and took a few breaths, trying his damnedest to hold his tears back. He studied his desk and noticed a layer of dust that wasn't there before. He surveyed the room with his cold gaze and noticed a thick accumulation of dust lying on top of every surface. How did this place get so dirty so quick? He questioned no one in particular. The cleaning company was just here last week. Anthony closed his eyes, hoping this was all just a terrible nightmare, the result of some bad combination of spoiled tacos and liquor. When he opened his eyes, the room remained the same, and the silence intensified. And now there were spider webs that laced the corners of the room in thick layers of albumin white. Anthony tried to clear his mind, push the thoughts away in the dark recesses, and bask in the empty silence. However, the silence was no longer there. Instead, there was a primal hiss that snaked its way through the air, and a mysterious scent that vaguely reminded him of spring showers and mildew. He looked at the fluorescent lights, softly humming overhead. A few flies crawled on the panels of light, skittering back and forth. The lights flickered, alternating between intervals of light and darkness, threatening to die out. Anthony's head filled with the sound of his blood rushing through his veins, vast oceans of red sloshing underneath his skin. He inadvertently swallowed his spit, and desperately prayed to any god listening. That springtime scent became sickening, filling his nostrils full of rot and decay. He gagged, clutching at his own throat for air. 2 ceiling tiles fell to the ground and clouds of dust rained down. Click. The lights went out and no god came. But something else did. An indistinct shape, a mass of darkness lumbering overhead, bubbled out. Row upon row of glossy eyes stared down at him, and thousands of limbs encased in a blob-like structure struggled to find purchase on the tiles. Anthony darted through the darkness, pushing aside office chairs, wheels spinning in the air, and headed for the doors leading to an escape from the office. He didn't dare turn back to see if the monstrosity was gaining on him. Instead, he charged out the exit and headed toward the stairs, guided by muscle memory, unsure if the elevators were out of commission along with the lights. By the time he made it down 3.5 flights of stairs, he heard the dreaded sound of the door winding open above him. Becoming hyper-aware of the sweat dripping down his back and covering his neck and seeping out of his armpits, he felt all too human, too soft, too fleshy. He picked up the pace despite his lungs burning and his sides cramping. Barreling through a twin set of doors that led outside gave him a sense of relief, and he hunched over, hands on knees, heavy breathing. The nighttime air smelled sweet and clean. Anthony eyed the parking lot and the cornfields, looking back and forth, knowing that thing was going to come busting through the doors behind him any minute. He decided on the cornfields, figuring his car was too far and gambling on the chance he'd find plenty of cover in the swaying stalks. Maybe I can hide out there and wait until this thing... My man, Tony! Anthony almost couldn't believe his eyes. His department manager, Benoit, casually walked towards him in his Armani suit, shiny Chelsea boots and Ferragamo shades, as if he didn't have a care in the world, as if that monstrosity wasn't going to pay them a visit from hell any moment now. He patted Anthony's sweaty back and looked down at his own hand, appalled. What the hell, Tony? You've been getting some cardio in on the stairs. This shit's nasty. You should have warned me. I mean, I understand, considering your weight, but I would have... The monstrosity came bursting through the doors and leapt on top of Benoit, crushing his sternum into the asphalt. His opulent shades went flying. Bones pocked through his expensive suit, and the thing slurped on his throat like a frozen fruit pop. Panicking, Anthony ran for the cornfields, patting his own throat to make sure it was still there. The cornstalks scratched his arms, face, neck, and ripped holes through his cheap shirt as he continued running. He ignored the minor flares of pain and moved deeper into the cornfield. Rotten cobs of corn popped underneath his feet, and he nearly fell. Despite the cover and distance, he could still hear the sounds of the monstrosity feeding on his former boss. Loud slurping and what he assumed to be the snapping of bones. Growing tired, he crouched down in the cornfield, taking in deep lungfuls of air as the sounds of feeding grew faint and distant. Crickets chirped in unison. This reminded him of his childhood, summers spent with his grandma and grandpa in Tennessee, and this memory brought him great comfort. The strain on his heart began to lift, and he wondered if he'd be safe throughout the night. Something began moving through the cornfields at a slow pace, and Anthony's heart rate picked back up again. The crickets stopped chirping, and he took that as a bad omen, knowing those insects only stopped singing at the sign of potential danger on the horizon. The scent of mildew and lilies tinged with copper made Anthony gag, but he cupped his mouth and forced his body to stay still. Not wanting to alert the monstrosity, he pictured himself still as a statue with no emotions, no feelings, and no human faculties whatsoever. The lumbering mass seemed to be moving in the other direction based on the tips of cornstalks moving in the distance. It's working. It's fucking working. Just have to make it through the night and then I'll be home free. Lauren will never believe my luck. Something tickled his nose. Allergies, maybe. And he sneezed. A loud, percussive sneeze that even a man with poor hearing would be able to catch. The cornstalks began swaying in his direction, and an anorexic scarecrow was sucked down into the earth with a frightening force. Wood splinters flew into the sky in an arc of mayhem. The monstrosity moved at a frightening speed, being alerted to his presence. Anthony got up, joints cracking, and he took off with no destination in mind. He ran farther than he ever thought he could, with the sound of cornstalks violently snapping behind him. The cloying smell of mildew and floral scents intensified, filling his nostrils, and he vomited. The mass pushed him down into the face of the cornfield, crushed corn surrounding him. Kernels smashed across his cheeks. The thing inhaled him, popping limbs like bubbles. The pain was hellish and overwhelming. Anthony had no idea how he was still conscious as his body was torn apart like a rag doll and consumed by darkness. His last ember of awareness died out as his face brushed up against his boss's distorted features, and he recognized the humanity embedded in physiognomy, and the loss of his own.